This is Johnny Dosco. Stay tuned for another Score Sheet podcast. Holy Kadelka!
Hello, and welcome to another Score Sheet podcast. Happy to say we have as a guest a gentleman I've known for a lot of years. Helped founded what is now called Rotowire, was Roto News back in the day, Mr. Jeff Erickson. How are you, Jeff?
Jeff, always good to talk to you. Good to talk some Score Sheet. Get away from Roto just for a second or two.
Yeah, I mean, you've had a number of Score Sheet teams for a few years, so even though your site is, like most fantasy sites, kind of a little more dedicated to Roto, you're pretty knowledgeable about Score Sheet.
At least I'm active. We'll see about knowledgeable. I'm in 4 Score Sheet leagues, and I didn't have that good of a year last year. Let's just leave it at that.
Well, as we were talking a minute ago, you kind of got up to where you had like 17 leagues, I think you said you were part of, between Rotisserie and Score Sheet and all, and it's hard to be a very active manager and make trades and all that when you have that many leagues.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I've found is I am finding myself just I'm really finding myself that I need to scale back to at least knock a couple leagues off. I'm either not actively managing my roster right, waiting too late before the trade deadline, missing out on trade opportunities, and maybe you're rushing picks, even in these scheduled drafts that we have in Score Sheet, which I love that tool, by the way. At first it took a little while to get used to the fact that I have to wait an hour before, when my slot comes up. But at the same time, when it's going to come up to, and you can plan in advance if you've got a busy day. So I think that's been definitely a positive advancement there for Score Sheet.
Yeah, no, well, of course, I like the web dev tool because it's our company, but I really like the fact that you can enter a few players, even if it's 2-3 picks away. I mean, you and I are in a business where March is, well, frantic to say the least. So being able to know that, I could just put 5-6 players in, and if 2 of them get picked in the next 4 hours, I'll just get the third guy on my list. Makes it a little easier to manage your time.
Yeah, especially as you get farther down, you're sifting through relievers. Sure, there's certain guys that you like more than others, but it's also a wider pool. So yeah, it makes it a little bit more useful.
Yeah. Well, speaking of drafts, I know you've done some keeper leagues and you're involved in drafts now. Are there any maybe Score Sheet specific guys that you would target that somebody might overlook?
Yeah, well, there's guys I'm targeting. The guys I'm playing with are better than me, so I don't think they overlook them. But here's some of the guys that I'm targeting. I've ended up with Ricky Romero in 2 of my Score Sheet drafts so far, A.L. Phillips and B.L. Kings. And in both cases, they qualify under the last year's bums moniker a little bit. But also him and Justin Morneau, I think I'm ending up owning everywhere that I possibly can. And in the case of Morneau, almost any format. And Roto, I might not be as aggressive in going after him, but in Score Sheet where, every starting pitcher has a pulse, it seems like, I'm going to take a chance on a guy that, has shown good skills. There's an argument maybe that he pitched above his component numbers in 2011, but he also pitched hurt last year, and I think he's healthy this year. I think that's going to make a big difference. And the acquisition cost is right. This is a guy that once was an ace, and even if he, devolves into a third starter that's better than what he was last year, that still has value, especially in the deeper formats that we play in.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like you're advocating somebody spend a first or second round pick on Ricky Romero, but there's going to be a lot worse pitchers taken higher than him just based on his horrible ERA last year.
Yeah, that's kind of the way I looked at it. In the National League, there's the Milwaukee down ballot starting pitchers are all really interesting. Marco Estrada's K rate was great last year. I know he has an issue with the gopher ball, but I find him very interesting. I find his teammate Willie Peralta interesting, and even Mark Rogers. I think all 3 of those guys, again, are going to be relatively cheap, and I think that they all are guys that I wouldn't mind having a few more shares of.
Even if you get one of those guys and he doesn't make the starting rotation out of spring training, people seem to forget there are so many injuries to pitchers that if you draft a guy who is a team's real-life 6 starter, chances are he's going to get to pitch plenty of innings. All it takes is one of the 5 guys in front of him to get hurt or have a lousy start to the year.
Yeah, that's right. The Brewers, they're kind of right in between being a contender. We talked about these National Leagues off air. These National League teams are all making a push. The Brewers, they're 2 years removed from being a playoff team. They had a down year last year. They lost Zach Greinke. They traded Zach Greinke midseason. But I think if they can get some health in the second half, some of these young pitchers develop quickly, they could still be a contender too. I know that the NL Central doesn't have the Astros to pick on anymore, and I think that's a subtle change that might hurt maybe the Reds and Cardinals a little bit. But I still think that they're kind of a closet contender in their own right, and if they get all those pieces together, all those young guys clicking, they could be pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think they're going to have to go some to win that division, I think, because St. Louis and Cincy are both looking pretty strong. I really like Cincy. But the wild card race, there's some really pretty good teams in the National League. They're going to be battling for a wild card this year.
Yeah, I think it's no longer true that 90 wins get you the wild card in the NL and you can get out of it there. I think the NL has ramped up their spending much like the AL. I think there's still a difference in quality between the two leagues. I think there's more star power right now in the NL, but I think there's a far deeper second tier in the American League. But I think that gap is finally starting to narrow a little bit. You see the Dodgers spending Confederate money this offseason. You see the Nats going after it pretty hard and heavy. Even the Braves going out and signing B.J. Upton and trading for Justin Upton. They're throwing their hat in the ring and they're trying to contend right now. I know that the Braves maybe don't have the same sort of spending ways as maybe some of the other teams in the NL, but the cost of the marginal win is going up in the National League. I wonder how that's going to change things. The Reds they're definitely a win now team. The Cardinals are just so deep. Even though they've lost Furcal, they lost Carpenter, they have a lot of different options to turn to, both at the major league level and in the farm system. Does Shelby Miller make the jump this year or not? What about Carlos Martinez? What happens with him? Of course, Oscar Taveras. I love to have plenty of shares of Oscar Taveras. He's nobody's idea of a sleeper, though. Anybody that knows prospects knows how good he is. But it's a question of when does he make that debut?
Yeah, I think Shelby Miller is a guy I'd like to get on some teams. Well, you're down there in Southern California. What about the Korean pitcher the Dodgers signed? I read something on your site today that they're talking about letting Ted Lilly be the fifth starter and moving that Korean, his name Rio, to the bullpen.
I hope that's wrong because I drafted him in a roto league. I drafted him in labor, and I even made the joke that overweight Korean pitchers are a new inefficiency. But we'll see. They have 8 possible starters, and Lilly, of course, when healthy, has been pretty effective. But the caveat has always been when healthy. Capuano, same thing. They've got 8 legitimate starting pitchers, and they got to find a way to make all the pieces fit. I don't know how they're going to do it because it's going to have to require a trade of some sort. I guess Ryu could pitch in the bullpen for a while. Ryu. I still haven't gotten official confirmation how to pronounce that. But Billingsley, how long is he going to be able to stay healthy? Same thing with Lilly. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see them make a trade at some point.
No, well, they could use some infield help. They could really use, a top third baseman. You'd think that with the premium on pitching in the world, they could trade a couple pitchers and get a third baseman. But third base is kind of a position of there's not exactly a lot of excess great third baseman lying around.
No, it's a question of them being able to find a guy that's going to go to free agency. It's starting to get too expensive. That's what their hope really much has to be. They actually have a bigger payroll than the Yankees right now. They've already proven that they're not averse to taking on more payroll. It's a bizarre team, though. It's the ultimate stars and scrub team. I mean, you look, Luis Cruz is their starting third baseman, and besides gesturing to his pitcher to intentionally plunk a guy, I don't know how much value he really has. I think he was kind of living on borrowed time last year. They have one of the worst contracts in baseball in Juan Uribe. Underrated how bad that contract ended up being, but he's still on the team. Maybe Mark Ellis goes over there. Maybe they find that D. Gordon's acceptable again. They can move Hanley back from shortstop to third. But that's not what their current situation. That's not a playoff third baseman, that's for sure. I mean, can the other guys make up the gap? Perhaps. But Crawford's already hurt, going to be delayed to the start of the season. Andre Ethier showed pretty decent signs of slippage last year. He's a guy I'm trying to fade actually a little bit right now. Although maybe he's like so unpopular that he'll become at a discount now. But for whatever reason, I just think his shelf life is pretty short right now. So they're a very strange team that way.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's hard to imagine having a payroll of $230 million, give or take a couple, and having Luis Cruz be your starting third baseman.
Right. Still having holes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, you would think they'd. Well, because the fact of the matter is, your starting third baseman is still going to get, or somebody from that position of batting, or 500 to 600 plate appearances. So no matter how many stars you have, that's a lot of outs if the guy is bad.
Exactly.
Yeah, speaking of draft strategies, you mentioned the last year's, I think you had a term for it, last year's
bums. It's really not even my term. It's Gene McCaffrey's term. I totally have co-opted and I use it all the time. But if you guys know Gene, he's a great writer, very insightful. WiseGuyBaseball.com. Check him out. His Wise Guy Baseball book is fantastic. So he's the guy that coined that term. It's a great concept because you're always trying to find ways to find a discount, find a sleeper. And hey, the best way to go is to find guys that have demonstrated a certain skill level, but for whatever reason haven't done it the last year or two. Usually you can get them at a pretty decent price, and there's just as good a chance of them bouncing back as there is some young guy taking the next step up.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think last year's bums, I mean, unless they really have gotten old all of a sudden. Maybe the 37-year-old you might have to figure isn't going to bounce back from a bad 36-year-old campaign. But some guy who's 31, 32, 30, and he's had a few good years, seems like a good bet. There's that, and then there's that post-type sleeper that we all have been kind of doing for the last few years, that draft Alex Gordon a couple years ago after 4 disappointing years, and you got rewarded hugely.
Brandon Phillips is another guy like that. And then I have the post-type sleepers that never wake up. Unfortunately, I have those too. And I just took Travis Snyder in another draft just yesterday. So some guys I just can't give up on. Although Travis Snyder, he's not that old. He just, he got called up so early, so it seems like he's old. But, Austin Kearns used to be that guy. I could never quit Austin Kearns. And I feel like Snyder's kind of that guy now.
Yeah, I took Brandon Wood for I don't know how many years in a row. Well, you and I have both, for years when we do these podcasts, have both been high on Homer Bailey, and we finally got some reward for that last year.
Yeah, just as long as you didn't start him at home in the first half of the season at least. I wonder, is that like signature significance? The way he finished the last 2 months of the season, is that going to carry over this year? I think there might be a little bit of that, but I also wonder. I mean, it's such a tough ballpark. One of the things that we, Chris Liss and I share a one score sheet team. We ask, how much do you account for ballpark when you're running the sim? That's one of the things that, it was a decision we had to make. And I wanted to ask you about that. Tell me, how much does that affect, when you're pitching in a nasty ballpark like Cincinnati or Colorado, how does that affect your sim?
We don't do ballpark effects, so...
Right, that's what I thought.
Yeah, so if you draft a Colorado pitcher and he gets shelled every time he pitches in Colorado, he is going to do badly for your score sheet team. And, we've done this 27 years, this will be now. So over the years, we've thought a lot about adding ballpark effects. We have this discussion, my partner and I, every couple years.
Sure.
The problem is, then you're taking their real-life stats and you're on purpose altering them. And folks, when they play a simulation... if they see their pitcher have a 3 ERA that week, they kind of want them to have a 3 ERA for them, and then adjust it, of course, whether they're facing hot batters or cold batters. But I think for us to artificially adjust their stats because of their ballpark would just add another element of stat wrongness, or whatever you want to call it, that our customers really don't want.
Yeah, I guess that's part of the sabermetric, non-sabermetric divide, I would guess. For whatever it's worth, I wouldn't mind a small adjustment. It doesn't even have to be like the full Monty, but it just sometimes you see like these quality guys, you can tell they're just getting crushed by the ballpark. The hitter, same way in Petco too. But although we don't know, that's not a fixed value, especially this year with them altering that ballpark and Safeco in the same sort of construction.
Yeah, I think this year aren't they moving the fences in 10 or 15 feet, something like that?
Yeah, up to 17 feet at one point in Safeco, and they're lowering the wall too in left field. They're also adding this big jumbotron in left field. So if there's any prevailing wind blowing in, that might get blocked a little bit by this big jumbotron. It's almost as big as the one at the Jerry Dome, if you will, for the Dallas Cowboys. But so I'm intrigued to see how that all plays out. I still think the marine layer is going to be the controlling factor, less the dimensions. I think that's certainly the case in San Diego, which has almost always been that way. Even in the Murph, it was still significant pitchers park too.
Yeah, no, I remember, like you said, 25 years ago, you'd read about hitters complaining that played for the Padres that they'd hit a long fly ball in Jake Murphy Stadium and it would just die out there on the warning track.
Right.
Yeah, well, I think Homer Bailey's unfortunately going to be a guy I don't get this year, because now there's going to be somebody in my league that does the opposite. They look just at last year's stats. They see some pretty decent stats and they'll snap him up. And he's burned me so many times. I'd like to have him, but I don't think I'll be willing to pay the price he's going to go for.
How about Aroldis Chapman? Are you going to own him anywhere this year?
Maybe in the middle round. My theory about drafting is you want to, kind of like Ron Shanley started saying a few years ago, you want to avoid risk in the early rounds. You can't really win a draft in the first round because you're all getting good players, but you can lose one if you draft a risky guy and he throws his shoulder out, like Strasburg a couple years ago. Chapman, if he lasts to the middle rounds, I'd like him. It seems like he should be able to take that stuff of his and turn it into a great starter.
As a Reds fan, I'm in favor of the move. I understand the risks involved, including durability, but short relievers aren't exactly known for being durable anyhow. I just feel like if you got a chance to have an above average guy give you more innings, you take it. And same with score sheet and same with fantasy. I won't take him in. Let's say if we're talking NL only league, I won't take him in the first 4 or 5 rounds, but after that, and I'm starting anew, Now, I'd probably even dig a little deeper. I maybe say eighth or ninth round, but I'd consider it there. If you're in a 10-team NL only, maybe about then, maybe sixth or seventh. I don't, I'd have to kind of play it out. It's funny, the NL only league that I do for Score Sheet is a keeper league, so I don't even have the option of taking him. So maybe I'll have to trade for him in that league. We'll see. If any of my compatriots are listening, you can bombard me with an offer for him. I'll probably accept, but we'll see.
Yeah, I'm in a 1-year NL league, so I'll get a shot at him. I think usually around the 8th or ninth round is when I'm thinking about my third starting pitchers. And yeah, if he's there in the 8th round and I've already got two kind of a little more sure bet type starting pitchers, I'd love to have him as a third pitcher. And then if he doesn't work out, well, how many third pitchers are sure bets?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. There's risk everywhere with pitching, as we see all the time. Yeah, and all the so-called durable guys, all it takes is just one. Once they get their first injury, sometimes they don't recover as quickly just because they haven't been injured as much before.
Yeah, they don't know how to recover. Well, I mean, I read on your site Zach Greinke had to have an MRI on his elbow, which I'm sure the Dodgers were less than thrilled. Spent $150 million, and before the guy even pitches in a single regular season game, you're having to do an MRI on his elbow.
Yeah, especially considering one of his selling points was his durability. But that MRI did come back clean. They said that it was negative for structural damage for whatever that's worth. But yeah, it's a little scary point there. And Greinke comes with his own performance risks too. I mean, the fact is that he's had a hard time in the NL West in the past. Some of that is facing the Dodgers. He doesn't have to face them anymore. But the other part might just be sample size too. But I do feel like he's one of those guys that's underperformed his component numbers most of his years.
He's a top-notch pitcher, but I don't know. That seemed a little risky. I'm kind of a fan of that. There are a couple pitchers, Justin Verlander, Clayton Kershaw, that I would be happy to draft in the first round.
Of course.
Of any draft. But I got to admit, in general, I don't take a pitcher in the first 2 or 3 rounds just because of their risks. Though a lot of times I have one of the worst ERAs in the league, and that almost means for sure you're not going to make the playoffs.
I take them earlier in Score Sheet than I do in Roto. It's a lesson I had to learn pretty quickly. Yeah, and I take more of them. You never can have enough depth when it comes to starting pitching, it seems like.
Yeah, that's what the people that are playing Score Sheet for the first time, whenever they happen to call or email me with a kind of a strategy question, that the 2 things I tell them to remember if they're coming over from Roto is pitchers are much more valuable, or at least go higher in drafts. You can't just spend the equivalent of 30% of your budget and expect to have a pitching staff that'll contend. And then, like you said, you can never have enough pitchers because injuries are just rampant. People don't always realize how many injuries there are in sports.
Well, and in most leagues, you can't just pluck a guy off the waiver wire the moment someone gets hurt either. We have supplemental drafts, and those are timed, and you sometimes are going to have to wait 3 weeks to get reinforcements, and they might not be that great either. I mean, if you're playing in a 24-team mix like I am in Murphy or Kings, the pickings get pretty slim, especially that second round of that supplemental. And same thing with a 12-team only league too. It's single universe league there. You're not going to find a whole lot out there.
No, you might get some guys with innings, but yeah,
the Rockies innings, non-park adjusted Rockies innings.
Yeah, Rockies innings. That's what you want to do when you're competing for the playoffs, is have the Rockies' 5th starter getting a bunch of innings for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of brutal. Well, let's switch gears here for a minute. You guys just did a big website makeover at rotowire.com.
Yeah, we did. It was a long time in the making. It was probably overdue. Last time we had a new design, I think it was 2006, I believe. We just wanted to make it a little cleaner. We want to put more information on the player pages, have something that's kind of up with the times a little bit more too. And I feel like we've accomplished that. I got kudos to our man, Aaron Quinn, handles a lot of our look and feel for the site, does a lot of our marketing. He's really a big force behind it. And of course, Peter Shanky, our president, put a lot into that as well.
Yeah, I think it looks great. I mean, now it's kind of a one-page answers your questions. For those of you that haven't gone to Rotowire, if you're sitting there at a draft with a laptop, which everybody is, or you're doing a web draft at home, so of course you have a computer going, you can go there and just make sure that before you pick a guy that he didn't get injured in the last 24 hours. Like I said, I read about Greinke this morning. They have up-to-the-minute injury news. They also have that player page that shows you a player's career stats and projections for next year. It's a really quick way to kind of double-check your draft pick.
Yeah, and one of the things I like using in drafts is our draft software, either on the computer or if you have a tablet, I've been using it on actually my iPad for the last couple of drafts, and you can use it for score sheet leagues too. It's a little bit different, obviously in Roto for like trying to figure out how to weight the categories is the tricky part. That's the thing about score sheet too, though, is you get to weight it according to your preferences. What's more important to you? Is on base more important than slugging? You can give it the added boost a little bit there. We don't try to project defense so much, especially in terms of range. That's one of the things that we're probably a little short on. We discuss it a lot with the players, but we don't necessarily do a defensive projection, if you will. That's the one thing we don't, so that you would just have to kind of weight that yourself a little bit. That's the one thing that's a little bit different. But you can input like the score sheet defensive rankings if you want, like the range tools, if you will.
Like you said, I mean, for a score sheet, you do as a manager get to kind of decide what's more important to you. If you value steals a lot in real life, draft guys that steal and score sheet. And if you're an on-base guy like I am, I don't even look at batting average anymore. I'm kind of sabermetric that way. I look at a guy's on base. I don't care if Adam Dunn hits 210 or 220 or what. If his on base is 330, I'm happy.
Yeah, exactly. Although it's funny that I think now I'm as sabermetric friendly as pretty much anybody, but I almost think that there is, I think batting average is a way is a skill still. I think there's a case for contact. I think that, you mentioned Adam Dunn. He's a perfect example that against certain pitchers, he's always going to be overmatched, even though he does take a lot of walks. Meanwhile, a guy like Ichiro in his prime, at least, was a little bit underrated. And, underrated in the sabermetric community, overrated in the mainstream, and I hate that phrase, but the non-sabermetric community, if you will.
Yeah. No, well, he was a darling of people, and like you said, I never warmed to him as much as I should have, and it kind of cost me, when you don't draft a guy because you don't feel good about him, and you keep losing to the team that has him, after a while you learn a lesson. Right.
And it just, and of course, as the playoffs come along, that in real life, sometimes the teams that make the playoffs usually have better starting pitchers, typically have better control, not in universes that don't count Gio Gonzalez, at least. And those teams that rely on the walk a little bit more, maybe they find it a little bit more difficult. I guess I'm trying to articulate a good case for this there. Chris Liss is always harping on this with me, so we always talk about that. But I think there's some semblance of fact to it, too.
Yeah. Well, hey, Jeff, it's been great talking to you. And for you folks that somehow haven't ever been to Rotowire, which has been around forever now. Well, you were Roto News when you started, correct?
Yes, we were. Back in 1997, we started as Roto News. We got bought out by a company called Broadband Sports in 1999. They died in 2001. We became Rotowire then.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm on it, I don't know how many times a day. So if you haven't checked it out, they have a great mix of, a huge amount of information for free. And then if you want things like that draft software, which people in the industry rave about, you can sign up for a very reasonably priced subscription. Thanks for taking the time to talk, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Anytime, Jeff. Take care.
All right, you too.